So what will we learn together from our fabulous guest, Cherian Koshy, today? I'm Martha Schumacher, and I'm glad you asked. Today, I want to share some thoughts on why active listening is so vitally important. As a reminder, improving mutual understanding is the definition and the goal, and practicing deep and consistent listening is about hearing, understanding, and ultimately validating what the other person is saying in response to your questions. Speaking of questions, to ask leading questions with a clear head is the first of 7 key active listening criteria. We'll actually also get into number 7 on that list today, empathizing, arguably the queen of all active listening elements, among many other topics, with my wonderful guest, Cherian Koshy. Before we do that, I wanted to remind folks of this first critically important element because often, when we ask great questions, we make the mistake of not listening to the other person's answer, and instead we start thinking about our next question. Sound familiar? I know it is for me, and I've been diligently studying and practicing active listening for decades now. Some lessons clearly we need to learn over and over again. What does this look like in practice? It means not only being present and hearing the other person's response to your question, but it also means asking pointed and relevant follow-up questions while making sure the conversation has plenty of room to breathe. What I mean by that is, whether the discussion is with your colleague, your peer, your direct report, your boss, your constituent, your board member, or your donor, these moments should never feel forced or scripted. For the record, when I train folks on how to ramp up listening actively with any or all of these audiences, we do talk about various scenarios like, if they say this, I should say that. So don't forget, as nonprofit social impact ambassadors, our number one goal in these donor scenarios is not to spend the entire time talking about our mission and why it's so important. I know that's tempting. Of course, that needs to happen, especially if it's your first meeting with them and especially if they have lots of questions. But even more important is to ensure that you're spending much more time, ideally at least 60 to 70%, hearing from them while you're asking open-ended questions. Along those lines, I've provided a cheat sheet of sorts in the show notes to help you think this through as you prepare for donor conversations. And speaking of donor conversations, the question I bring to our chat today is grounded in focusing more on the stewardship part of the donor cycle versus our tendency to focus largely, if not solely, on our solicitation language. Once someone makes a financial gift, while we've become somewhat adept at acknowledging that gift by mail, email, phone, etc., often we go right back to fixating on cultivating them for that next gift. Today's questions all help us to avoid falling into that same old trap. First, we get a question from our guest. How does integrity guide the decisions that you make? You'll hear some great insights on how to promote generosity without compromising integrity. Then my question is, what inspired you to give? And when you ask, what inspired you to give, don't forget, it doesn't always have to be about giving money. For example, what inspired you to give your time? What inspired you to raise your hand? Today we also explore a listener question, this one from Tycely Williams, CEO of Liberty Fellowship. She asks Cherian, how does radical empathy show up in your work day to day? This is a powerful question to ask folks in any sector. And what I especially like is that it can stop just about anyone in their tracks. In other words, this question forces folks in any and every organizational role to take a beat and examine whether they are being empathetic. And if so, where, when, how, and why? If not, what do they need to do about it? It is educational in terms of reminding them that they should be seeking to understand the person's experience. Again, we're back to improving mutual understanding, and it allows the person to evaluate their feelings. And now, here's our exploration of friction, distraction, integrity, inspiration, empathy, the importance of accountability partners, and much, much more. I'm glad you asked. Welcome to Glad You Asked, a show about how active listening can help you build stronger connections with folks in your life, personally and professionally. I'm Martha Schumacher, and I've spent my career asking leaders, funders, donors, and community members thoughtful questions to help find the real reasons behind why they do what they do. And when you pursue these deeper connections, you ultimately arrive at the heart of what really matters, establishing trust. On each episode of Glad You Asked, we'll explore 3 questions, one from our guest, one from a listener, and one from me. During a conversation with mission-driven leaders, we'll test how each question, each compelling prompt, makes active listening possible and deepens our relationships. Afterwards, we'll take a look at how effective our questions were in guiding a meaningful conversation and leave you with a call to action so you can use these questions in your own work and life. Now, let's meet our guest. Cherian Koshy is not only one of the smartest people in the social impact sector, he's one of the smartest people in any sector. Even better, he also happens to have one of the biggest hearts. Cherian is the founder of Engage, vice president of Kindsight, and board treasurer of AFP Global. Yet with all of that, still somehow he was bored, sitting around spending too much time gaming, so he decided to write a book, his first book, and it's called Neurogiving. Seriously, though, folks, it's terrific. Stay tuned to get a free copy. With that, Cherian, welcome to Glad You Asked.
Jeez, Martha, thanks for having me. That is quite the introduction that is definitely undeserved, but I appreciate you so much. Thanks for having me on.
So is it undeserved that I joked about you gaming, or undeserved? What exactly was undeserved about that? That's what I want to know.
It's way too kind.
How are you today, Cherian?
I am doing very, very well. I'm doing very, very well. How are you?
I'm doing great, especially because I get to be here with you. It's so much fun.
Yes.
All right. Well, listen, why don't we go ahead and just dive into these questions? And I'm going to throw it to you, Cherian, for your question and also kind of your thoughts on that question as well.
Yeah, you bet. So my question was, how does integrity guide the decisions you make? And then, does this create more generosity or more friction? I think in fundraising, we tend to overestimate our strategy and underestimate the donor's psychology. And the truth is that generosity isn't fragile, that what we've seen throughout human history is that people are generous. They continue to be generous. And that has been proven out through things like the Giving Institute's Giving USA report. We see that people continue to be generous over time. It's interruptible, though. Like, there are times where people stop giving or decrease their giving. But every time we get worried about generosity, whether it's an economic time in our country or there's a crisis that happens. I mean, internationally, you and I have been at conferences together internationally. We've seen people that are fundraising in war-torn areas, and there's still people that are giving in the worst of circumstances, but there's still generosity. So what I always say is the enemy of good fundraising isn't no, it's not now. And we live in a world where lots of things are coming at us. We have lots of emails, lots of social media, lots of life, right? Like, there's so much that's happening. The doorbell rings, it's not that we don't care. It's just a life comes at us. And if we just can't do the generous thing in the moment that we want to do it, then we'll just say, oh, best of intentions, we'll do it later. We default into forgetting. So for me, that question forces clarity and accountability and alignment across, honestly, any role in an organization, but honestly, personally as well. Like, am I being generous in my relationships as well? Generous in how we're engaging with our our leadership, with the relationships that we have with board members, with our teams, with our community members. There's so many applications of that all have to do with the different pieces of how we think about generosity. And there's so many ways in which we might unintentionally create barriers to that generosity experience. You've been in a CEO seat, you've been in a board chair seat. I've been on a board with you as a board chair. Like those are some places where I know you've had those experiences as well, and you've been a very generous leader, expressing those types of values. And I know that those are ways in which you've shown up in a lot of different ways as a generous person, in addition to being a generous donor.
Well, thank you for that so much. And the check's in the mail to you. Just kidding. Speaking of money. Just kidding. No, I really appreciate that. And it was just such a pleasure serving on the AFP Global Board with you.
Thank you.
I hear you. And I think, in a way, right, this is a great entree kind of back into the point of this podcast, which is about active listening. I think we're talking about respect, we're talking about authenticity, and we're talking about, I hope, really good, deep listening. And the person across from you feeling heard and understood. What do you think about that?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's the piece that sometimes we miss is, does the person sitting across the table really feel heard and understood? Or are we trying to extract something from them? And this might be, stop me if this is going way off the rails, but I talk a lot about AI, having built and sold an AI company. A lot of people ask me to do AI workshops. And one of the things that people ask me to talk about is, where are we going with AI? And where I am very worried about AI in fundraising is actually the piece around active listening, because AI doesn't have the ability to do active listening. It can be objective about literally what it hears from the person that it's engaging with. And so it can obtain facts and then have a goal related to those facts. For example, I've been in a room where someone says, I just want an uncomplicated planned giving option. If AI hears that, it will say, oh, you want a bequest. You want a revocable bequest gift. That's the answer, because that's the least complicated of the options. But in active listening, given some time and some other questions, you might get to the understanding that what this donor really wants is something else. I've had that situation actually happen with a donor who said, like, I actually don't want to leave this money. I actually want to see this gift in action today. There's actually a donor who was hard of hearing, and they wanted to see live translation of a performance at a performing arts center. They wanted to see that happen. And so we funded, she funded it. It was a bequest gift, and she actually gave the money right away. And then we brought her to a performance, and she was able to see it live. And that, like, before she died, and that's what she loved. She, like, her face lit up. 90-year-old woman just lit up because she was able to see it, and see kids who were hard of hearing be able to see a ASL, performance.
My gosh, you just gave me chills.
And I mean, it was just magical for her. And she thanked us profusely for giving her that experience, right? That's what AI can't do, because AI would try to close the gift. AI would say, clock that as a bequest and move on.
And would have made an assumption, right?
Precisely. That active listening component is really a human-to-human activity. It's something that humans want to do with other humans. We don't want to have those types of relationships with a robot. We want to have those relationships. We want to share those experiences with a human, not with an artificial being.
We're talking about human connection and community, right?
You're exactly right. Like, I think those are experiences that, even if it could do it, we ought to reserve it for human spaces. And so, like, when I come back to this question, how does integrity guide the decisions that you make? And that was connected to this, like, does it create generosity? Because integrity is the point that this makes, is like, sometimes the tools, the technology, the strategy will lead us to suboptimal results if we try to take the quick answer, click the easy button. And so all of this other stuff that we talked about feeds into this, right? Like
Yes.
like the integrity piece would say to us, don't do the thing even if it can do the thing, right? Like, even if the technology gets you there, you ought to say, as a human first, as a nonprofit professional, as a fundraiser, as a CEO, this should not be the thing that we do. And I know that that can be hard, but if the question is, how does integrity guide the decisions you make when things get hard? There are times where, you know what? It's hard for us to say no to revenue. It's hard for us to not do things as efficiently. The work that we do every day is messy work. It's truly, like, time-consuming, messy work to sit in front of a human who is dealing with grief of losing a loved one. They're wrestling with their personal legacy, right? And so that's the intertwining of, does this create generosity? Does it actually open up that generosity experience? Or does it make it harder for someone to live out their values? And I think that integrity says to us, maybe it just does need to take longer. Maybe there isn't an easy way through this. I don't know. I wonder what you think.
Well, I think all of the above, as we so often are. I think we're very much in mind meld on this. I love the word integrity. I think the word integrity is the key there. The other thing I would say is, when things get hard, is at the heart of that question. As much as integrity is key, it's when the things get hard, right? Because it's kind of that old line that I think we've talked about, that I think originally might have, at least in my world, might have come from Bob Carter, around when you're trying to be a good leader, if everything's going well, almost anyone, right, can lead in those moments. But when things get hard, that's really what separates the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. So yeah. I 100%.
I think that's the pernicious element of what I'm seeing in the sector today, is like, we're trying to move as many people into a funnel and through a pipeline.
Yes.
We just need to make sure that our priorities are right. And that comes back to, like, the integrity piece.
Well, we could easily spend our entire episode today on these questions, no doubt about it. That said, speaking of kind of coming back to donors, the question that I'm bringing to the table today is simple, and yet complex and simple all at the same time, which is, we tend to, in our field, right, think so much about how do we cultivate, and then especially what are the words we use to solicit someone. That I just feel like that we get pretty obsessed with that. I really love that stewardship question right after they've made their gift, which is, what inspired you to give?
So here's my answer. A lot of people talk about, like, someone inspiring them to give money. And my parents did give money, like, tithing at church and things like that, but they weren't very public about that piece. Their giving that was very visceral to me was in our home. So my parents immigrated from India in the 1970s, and when they came, my mom came over first, and she lived with some family members, and then my dad came over later, and then we had a home in Minnesota. And essentially, my earliest memories are that our home was never our own. And what I mean by that is, there was never a time in my childhood where there was not someone else living in our home. So at every point, there was some other family that lived in our house, whether it was, an uncle and aunt and their family or someone else. Like, for my entire childhood, we always had another family that was
Wow.
living with us. And this was not like a week or a month, it was years. Like, years of people living in our house, sharing bathrooms, and that was and then like one family would leave and they would go get an apartment or a house, and then another family would come, and I mean, repeatedly, over and over and over again. And I hadn't, like, this is just how I grew up. It's how I lived, and so I didn't know that people didn't do this. And this is how they came to the country, and they were just paying it forward. They were just opening up their home to other people and really truly helping them get into the country by giving them a place to live, giving them food, and buying clothes and offering them the car and getting them to like citizenship things and helping them take the test and all of those things that are these very deliberate things that you need in order to get your footing into this country. And I didn't realize the depth of that generosity until I was out of that, and then I lived in a house on my own, and I was like, oh, we're the only people here. Like, what's going on? Like, this is awkward. This is weird. Like, how do we? And so when I bought a house, like, we intentionally bought a house with extra rooms in it, and I didn't even consciously think of why, but that was why my parents bought the house that they did, and why they had extra rooms in it was because of that intentionality. I guess somewhere in the back of my mind, I was like, oh, well, like, people are going to come and they're going to stay and they're going to need this space, and we don't have people living with us in the same way. But the minimal things that we do in comparison to what my parents did, it feels so minimal to write a check. So, like, when generosity is that significant and felt and sacrificial, it's like writing a check feels very insignificant in my mind.
Wow. Well, first of all, you do so much. You do so much for our nonprofit community and for the world, and you're amazing. So what I'm hearing, I think you every day, pretty much from the day you were born, philanthropy being, the love of it was mankind, but I hope now we're all saying humankind,
Yeah.
that was just there from birth for you because it was being lived out in, living color every day, all day. And you don't know any, like, it's funny because, right, someone might say to you, well, what was that like? And you would not be able to say, well, here's how it was different from the way, because it's how you grew up. It's what you knew and it's what you know. So that is, to me, what inspired your parents to give, meaning to give their, to open up their home, it was because someone else did it for them, and it's what you do.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts on that part? Because I think that's just so profound to me and compelling.
So in Western society, we tend to think of generosity as like writing the check or even like this volunteer experience. And in other countries, what generosity means is something very different. And it means this encompassing idea that is community help, right? Like, it is something bigger and broader. And you see that everywhere else. Like, I mean, like I said, you and I have been in other places where, like, in those communities, they like, somebody needs it and they just show up and they take care of people. And that's what everyday generosity looks like. And they live it, and they don't think about, oh, I should go write a check to solve this problem.
I'm going to just turn it on its head a little and say to you, I hope we haven't totally lost that.
Yeah.
I do still find that I see in action every day, and I read about still every day some positive examples
Absolutely.
of that I hope we can hold on to in a time when I think we do need a lot of hope.
Yeah.
But I hear you 100%, and it's absolutely a concern of mine as well.
I'm curious about your story. I'd love to hear your story.
This was my early days in fundraising when I was at Greenpeace, and I was in the LA area. And I was sitting down with a donor who had recently made a gift. And this, by the way, is quite a while ago. And obviously, I'm not going to name names, but I think I'm okay with naming amounts. So this was a donor who had given $10,000, which for Greenpeace at that time, and also probably more importantly, that person, the most they had ever given was $500. And I knew for a fact that no one had asked for that. So, someone giving a $10,000 gift without being asked and having that kind of giving history, very much, wanted to sit down with her and did that as part of my, overall donor trip in the LA area. And so I'm sitting with her and asking what inspired her to give. So what inspired you to give? I looked at her and said, and she had her 2 kids with her that day. They were 8 and 10. And she was recently divorced, a single mom. And I, kind of made it clear that in so many ways that they had been struggling financially, and that, this was obviously both emotionally and, I should say emotionally, logistically, financially, all the things, very challenging. And she said, well, here's what happened. She said, I was thinking about how much the kids had been through. And I wanted to, I might get a little choked up here. I wanted to give them something special because of the hard times we had all been experiencing. And so I decided I would take them to Disneyland, meaning, we're in California.
Yeah.
And she said, my 8 and 10-year-old said, they looked at me and said, Mom, I think we should give that money to Greenpeace. So that $10,000 gift was these kids and this mom foregoing, their vacation that was, I think, sorely needed to take that money and give it to Greenpeace. So had no one asked that question, right, we would have never known.
That's amazing.
When I got back to the office and shared this with the development team as well as some of the program folks, because I think it's so important, right, that you make sure the program people know what a difference their work is making in the world. And sometimes, especially at a place that's the size of the institution that Greenpeace is globally, sometimes that can get lost.
Yes.
There was not a dry eye in the room, and I barely got through it. I mean, I was with them on the tears. So
I think that's exactly why that question is so important, because there's a story behind everyone's why. And if we don't ask that question, we won't really understand the intention or the depth behind the gift. And even if we're not sharing that publicly, sharing it with the program team or the fundraising team, just so that they understand that it's not about the ask necessarily. It's not about the thing that came before. There's a motivation that came on the part of the donor or their family or something like that really drove this decision that's so meaningful to them. I think that's incredible. I love that story. That's great.
Yeah, it's speaking of inspiring, right? What inspired her to give? She inspires us, right? So,
yes.
Well, we have one more question. This question comes from our friend Tycely Williams, who's now the CEO, at Liberty Fellowship. Yes, hi, Tycely. And it really is a question that I think it's really for folks across all roles in all sectors, frankly. And it's about something that shows up in your book pretty significantly. And the question is, how does radical empathy show up in your work day to day? And I just want to remind folks that term radical empathy kind of came into part of the vernacular, so to speak, in 2021, and that was Terry Given's book of that same name. Another great book, Cherian.
Yes.
By the way, folks, that is one of, and arguably the key active listening element of the 7 elements. So let's hear your thoughts on this question.
Yeah. Well, as always, I'm grateful for Tycely's inspiration, and one of my oldest friends. I've known her since high school, so I've always been learning from Tycely, and this is no different. So empathy is something that's certainly covered in the book because it's one of those elements that's crucial in the neuroscience and behavioral science of the work that we do. But it's not only essential, it's also complicated in our work. Empathy is a biological shortcut that our brains use. And what I mean by that is essentially our brains are always functioning as if our brains are a cell phone that's on 1%, right? And so it's not that our brains don't want to do things, but they're trying to conserve as much energy as they can. And so empathy collapses distance, and it helps us predict behavior, and it creates the trust that the people that we're dealing with, that trust that we need to act. The flip side is also true, that empathy is where potentially biases might hide. So our brains find the familiar and favor the familiar. You might say something to me, and someone else might say, something that may be more true, but I implicitly trust you because of our shared history. But what they're saying may be more true. It's hard to believe, but that may be the case.
And you're talking about bias, right? We're talking about implicit bias.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. And so I think the unfortunate part is that we tend to empathize with people who look like us, talk like us, walk like us, sound like us, remind us of our own stories. So for me, radical empathy actually shows up more as a discipline than a feeling. It's a commitment to expand who I include in my circles of care, even when my wiring pushes me in the opposite direction. So how that shows up in the day-to-day is how I design my work, my writing, my workshops, my keynotes, how I develop the things that I speak about or I think about. Even when I built products, I think about who am I designing this stuff for, and who am I forgetting as I'm creating whatever I'm creating, because I think both of those pieces are essential. So radical empathy for me invites me to slow down before I'm making assumptions, which I think is essential for leaders. And it's also important to widen the frame so that more people can see themselves inside of the narrative that we're creating. One of the things that happened to me as a leader is that I didn't realize early on how different staff members were coming from different perspectives of my leadership style and what that meant for how they were perceiving certain things that I was doing. And when I was open to criticism, to sitting down and in one-on-ones to say, how does this coming across to you? That allowed them to share, actually, I think this is coming across this way, and this is actually not helpful. That allowed me to see things from a very different perspective, that what I was doing was actually not inclusive. It wasn't creating belonging for them. And that was not my intention at all, but was the impact, it was the effect of what I was doing. And I could go back and say, okay, I need to change what I'm doing because that wasn't my intention at all. So I think it's really transformative for leaders, for CEOs, for staff members, for board members, because it shifts them from an outside metric into meaning creation, and it forces them to connect their daily work to that human impact. And once someone reconnects to radical empathy, those decisions become much more expansive and more ethical and more aligned with really what they want to accomplish.
That is fantastic. And I also want to say hats off to you for being open to that, right? Because I think one of the biggest things that we make a mistake around in leadership roles, whether it's, around, managing people, leading people, which are two different things, but often you have to do both on a daily basis, is being open to that feedback and making some of those changes and understanding that when you have a crucial conversation, which by the way is, I think, one of my favorite books is Crucial Conversations, which has sold over 5 million. And there's a reason for that, is this whole idea, right, of when stakes are high, emotions are high. And often in those management situations, that's how it is for understandable reasons, that you were, willing and able to kind of make a shift.
Yeah, I will just speak for myself in saying that there are times where I don't feel very self-aware of when my actions don't exhibit empathy, and it helps me to have some trusted friends like you who would speak into certain things and say, with love and grace, Tycely's a good friend as well. It's what I need, right? I need people in my life to say, you did something wrong, and here's how we're going to fix it. And so there are people who are very good at being self-aware and knowing, like, this is what you need to do to fix it. There are times where I would love to say that I can do that, and like the warning signals go off and I do understand. There are other times where I do need accountability partners in my life who are just like, you probably didn't realize that you did something or said something, and this is how you need to fix that in the moment or for the future. And I appreciate that. I know that there are instances where that helps me to be the person that I want to be.
Well, again, I think a lot of that also comes back to you being open to that feedback. Life's a journey, right? It's continuous, we hope, improvement and evolution, and sometimes learning certain lessons over and over and over. So there's that, right?
Yeah. The truth is that no tree can grow strong if it's not beaten, battered by the wind. So if you don't have those kinds of stresses in your life, you're not going to be able to grow strong.
So my last comment on this question about radical empathy is, it turns out that empathy really is one of, if not the key elements of being a good active listener. And, there's sympathy and there's empathy, and that maybe that's a discussion for another day. But, and obviously the distinction tends to be, or at least historically has been around having sympathy for someone, but not being able to have empathy because you haven't actually walked in their shoes. But my take on it tends to be more around that empathy is, hey, have you ever had a bad day? Yep, me too. There are a lot of ways, right, that people, no matter what their lived experience is, can find the empathy for each other in what's happening in their lives, no matter where they're from, no matter what their lived experience is. And I think for me, that's one of the keys to being able to really, again, be a great active listener and prioritize empathy.
Oh, geez, you're right. This could be a whole episode on its own. There's so much to empathy.
Yes.
But hopefully Tycely will cover that because she's brilliant.
There you go. I like that. Well, Cherian, I can't thank you enough. Before I let you go, I just want to remind folks, his brand new book is going to go to the first 5 people who subscribe and then DM me with a screenshot on LinkedIn or by email. And don't worry, I promise, folks, I won't spam you. This is just so you can get your hands on this wonderful book from Cherian, which, as we're going to press anyway, is breaking all records. There are a lot of those books flying out the door or flying into your Kindle or however we want to talk about it.
Well, thank you for doing that. I really appreciate it, and I hope people get value out of the book. But I I really appreciate you doing this for the sector, but most of all, I appreciate your friendship, and I hope that we can continue this conversation in person sometime, because this is really an interesting topic.
Love it, Cherian. You take care, and I'm really glad you were my guest today. I'm glad you asked. What a wonderful chat with Cherian. Among so many important topics, his insight into the psychology of giving is invaluable. Now let's reflect on how the 3 questions guided our conversation today, starting with mine. What inspired you to give? This crucial prompt actually inspired Cherian to share his own very personal story, giving us context and deep insights into his generational and cultural framework around generosity. I then asked an important follow-on question, which was, what else? This laid the path for him to provide a broader context of Western ideals of generosity versus other parts of the world. This shows how your questions can inspire a wide-ranging conversation, from a deep personal framework to a larger, more global framework with just that one simple question. I know Cherian quite well, yet asking this question of someone you're just getting to know can have the same effect. And for that matter, there is so much I learned about him today, which also shows how asking these questions, even of people you thought you knew really well, can open up a whole new avenue towards greater mutual understanding, which, yes, again, is the definition of active listening. The next question also allowed Cherian to be vulnerable and self-reflective. This query can give you the opportunity to get to know someone better as well. Tycely Williams, a longtime friend of Cherian's, as it turns out, and a longtime friend and colleague of mine as well, asked a terrific question, which was, how does radical empathy show up in your work day to day? Here's an important moment to give yourself grace. Empathy, it turns out, doesn't always come naturally. To reiterate Cherian's sentiments, quote, radical empathy actually shows up more as a discipline than a feeling, unquote. Don't forget to let your conversation partner know, and also, by the way, yourself, that we all put in work to be more empathetic, and that there are tools to help us practice empathy, including having accountability partners. So both of these questions, first, what inspired you to give? And second, how does radical empathy show up in your work day to day? Might take some practice with a conversation partner as they unpack and build trust with each other. Take a deep breath and remember to bring patience with you into these conversations. To come back around to the third question, which was Cherian's at the top of the interview, how does integrity guide the decisions you make? In an ideal world, integrity guides everything we do. Always keep in mind whether our actions are causing generosity or friction in these scenarios. Yet ultimately, efficiency should never take precedence or priority over integrity. As we do on every episode, I'd like to close out the show with an action item. Coming back to Cherian's full question, how does integrity guide the decisions you make when things get hard? Your assignment for this episode is, over the next few days, seek out someone you respect. It could be a colleague, could even be a friend or a family member, and ask them this question. And here's my question to you today. How did they respond? What stood out for you? Do their values align with yours? And what can you learn from their answer? When you ask, make your best effort to clear your mind, be present, and listen with empathy when they reply. One more thing. Don't forget to grab a screenshot of your Glad You Ask Patreon subscription and DM me with it on LinkedIn or by email. The first 5 will get a copy of Cherian's excellent book, Neurogiving. And join us next episode for a conversation with the wonderful Amiki Carol Akawumi. Thanks for listening to Glad You Asked, a Hazen Institute for Leadership training podcast. If you enjoy the show, come find me on Patreon for more in-depth content. You can also follow me on LinkedIn. This show is produced by the amazing Patrick and Benjamin Childers of Odd Conduit Media. Please check the show notes for our guest links, today's questions, and more information. A massive heartfelt shout out to my father, Hazen Schumacher, who taught me the power of audio storytelling through his weekly radio show, Jazz Revisited, and to Basil and the Supernaturals, featuring Kevin Thompson and Herbie Hunkley for making original music. If you have a question you'd like me to put out there on our show, send me a message on LinkedIn or send me an email at hello@hazeninc.com. Have you used a question from our show in your life? If so, drop us a line and tell us how it went. You can also learn more about my work at hazeninc.com. Tune in next time to keep exploring active listening on another episode of Glad You Asked.